Chapter 1. Old Testament Terminology for the Heavenly Host. Not surprisingly, understanding what the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, says about the members of God's heavenly host must begin with the biblical text. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that merely detecting all the references in the Old Testament to angels accomplishes that task. As will become clear, there are a number of terms aside from angel that need discovery and consideration. But there is a preliminary step to casting that wider terminological net. Before we encounter the range of terms for the beings who serve God in the spiritual world, we need to grasp the fact that a given word will not necessarily yield the same kind of information about those spirit beings. To illustrate, the label spirit being tells us only about the nature of a particular being. It is not embodied, not what that being does in God's service or its particular status in God's heavenly bureaucracy. This last sentence directs our attention to three kinds of information, all of which are relevant to the terms we'll consider in this chapter. Note, the terms we'll discuss in this chapter will also be relevant to rebellious spiritual beings, but there are additional terms for spiritual beings who are hostile to God. End note. 1. Terms that describe nature, what the members of the heavenly host are or are like. 2. Terms that describe status, the hierarchical rank of the members of the heavenly host with respect to God and each other. 3. Terms that describe function, what the members of the heavenly host do. Old Testament descriptions of the members of God's heavenly host typically fall into one of these categories, with occasional overlap. Our task in this chapter is to survey the terms in each category. We will reserve lengthy discussion of what these terms teach us about the heavenly to Chapter 2. Terms that describe nature. 1. Spirit, ruach, plural, ruachot. The Old Testament makes it clear that the members of God's heavenly host are spirit beings, entities that by nature are not embodied, at least in the sense of our human experience of being physical in form. Note, this point is not contradicted by passages that refer to angels as men and that have them performing physical acts. When angels interact with human beings, appearance in human form or actual embodiment is normative in Scripture. Without taking some form that could be detected and parsed by the human senses, angelic presence and interaction would be incomprehensible. The words of Jesus in Matthew 22:23-33 do not forbid the inclusion of Genesis 6:1-4 on this point. Jesus was speaking about angels in heaven, the spiritual world, not on earth among humans. Jesus could just as well have said angels do not eat or breathe in heaven, since there is no need for a stomach, lungs, and heart in the spiritual world. End note. This spiritual nature is indicated in several passages. The prophet Micaiah's vision of Yahweh, the God of Israel, reads as follows: I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him, on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth-Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit, ruach, came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, By what means? And he said, I will go out, and will be a lying spirit, ruach, in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit, ruach, in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. 1 Kings 22:19-23. Compare to 2 Chronicles 18:18-22. There are two important observations to make in this passage. First, the members of the host of heaven are identified as spirit beings in this passage. Second, this spirit being is sent by God to be a lying spirit in the mouth of Ahab's prophets. We are therefore not supposed to read this passage as though its point was that God gave Ahab's prophets some sort of internal emotional anxiety or psychological confusion, as though God was troubling their individual spirits, their minds and thoughts. While ruach can certainly be used to describe a person's intellect and emotional state, 1 Kings 22:19-23 clearly identifies the lying spirit as a member of all the host of heaven who await instruction from their king. This spirit either took control of the minds of Ahab's prophets or influenced them to speak unanimous deception to the wicked king. Note, some readers may have difficulty with God's use of deception to judge evildoers, but it is plainly taught in Scripture. At times the deception is in the context of warfare. In other instances, God uses deception to set the stage for his judgment. It is up to the righteous judge to determine how evil is punished. By definition, his punishment of evil is just and not unjust. End note. The divine throne room scene in 1 Kings 22:19-23 is therefore useful for considering other instances where ruach may point to an unembodied entity, but where ambiguity exists. In this regard, the following passages are relevant. Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years, and God sent an evil spirit, ruach, between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem. And the leaders of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. Judges 9:22-23. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit, ruach, from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servants said to him, Behold now, a harmful spirit, ruach, from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre, and when the harmful spirit, ruach, from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will be well. 1 Samuel 16:14-16. The next day, a harmful spirit, ruach, from God, rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. 1 Samuel 18:10-11. The princes of Zon have become fools. The princes of Memphis are deluded. Those who are the cornerstones of her tribes have made Egypt stagger. The Lord has mingled within her a spirit, ruach, of confusion, and they will make Egypt stagger in all its deeds, as a drunken man staggers in his vomit. Isaiah 19:13-14. When the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, Say to your master, Thus says the Lord, Do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the young men of the king of Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit, ruach, in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. Isaiah 37:5-7. In each of these passages, a spirit, ruach, is sent from God, and that spirit affects the individual or group in an adverse way. Are these descriptions best understood as God in some way affecting the internal state of mind of the individuals in view, or dispatching an unembodied entity to affect behavior? One could easily conclude, based on the usage of ruach to describe a person's thoughts, feelings, and decisions, that the latter perspective makes sense. However, in light of 1 Kings 22:19-23, which uses quite similar language to that found in these passages, it is at least possible that unembodied divine spirits in the service of Yahweh are in view. Note: for our purposes, there is no need to launch into a detailed exegetical defense of a divine entity interpretation and rebuttal of the alternative. Rather, these and other passages are clear enough to establish the fact that the Old Testament presents the members of the heavenly host as spirits in the same way the New Testament will. In Revelation 1:4, for example, the 7 angels of the churches addressed in Revelation 1-3 are referred to as spirits. As Owen notes, a second important view, in my opinion certainly the correct one, understands the 7 spirits as the 7 principal angels of God. In early Jewish literature, the term spirits was used only rarely as a synonym for angels, or of various types of heavenly beings. The 7 angeloi, literally angels, are those to whom the 7 proclamations in Revelation 2-3 are addressed. End note. A potential ambiguity of another sort is produced by the fact that the Hebrew word ruach can also mean wind. This semantic possibility produces uncertainty in regard to interpreting Psalm 104:4. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind, ruach. He makes his messengers, melachim, winds, ruchot. His ministers a flaming fire. Psalm 104, 1-4. The term melachim is the plural of the Hebrew word translated angels throughout the Hebrew Bible, melach. In the ESV translation, that plural is rendered messengers. These messengers are referred to as winds in the English Standard Version, but the Hebrew ruchot could just as easily be translated spirits. It isn't uncommon for commentators to understand Psalm 104:4 as referring only to winds, elements of nature or the weather, and not divine beings. The ESV reflects this perspective, as its translation effectively has God poetically making the winds his messengers. Golden Gay's comments are representative of this approach. Other aspects of creation then form the means whereby God affects other aspects of this management. The clouds are Yahweh's limousine, the winds its means of propulsion, both the winds and the lightning Yahweh's aides and officers. Note: another scholar, David Francis Hinson, notes, "These prophets knew that many forces exist in nature which can affect humans, but they believed that these were under God's control, wind and water, fire and frost." End note. This perspective is what leads scholars like Un to conclude the plural term ruchot, spirits, is never used of angels in the Old Testament. This interpretation of Psalm 104:4 is unconvincing. The preceding psalm and comparative ancient Near Eastern descriptions of angels compel the conclusion that Psalm 104:4 is describing angels as spirits. Psalm 103:20-22 reads, "Bless the Lord, O you his angels, melachim, you mighty ones who do his word, obeying the voice of his word. Bless the Lord, all his hosts, his ministers who do his will. Bless the Lord, all his works, in all places of his dominion. Bless the Lord, O my soul." The observation to make here is that the angels are referred to as ministers. The Hebrew word thus translated is identical to that which occurs in Psalm 104, his ministers a flaming fire. Why translate melachim as angels in Psalm 103:20, but messengers in Psalm 104:4? The angels in Psalm 103:20 are also called mighty ones who obey the command of God, obeying his voice. Mighty ones, giborim, is a term used of human warriors throughout the Hebrew Bible. It is nowhere else abstracted to speak of the forces of nature. It does not seem reasonable to make Psalm 104:4 an exception, especially since, as we'll discuss below, angels are described as men and as a warrior host in the Old Testament. Note: this is hardly an idiosyncratic perspective. For example, Krauss writes, in Psalm 103:20 and 148:2, the melachim, angels, belong to the circle of heavenly powers around Yahweh who praise and honor him, but God also sends out messengers and servants. He charges his angels to protect his servants in all their ways. End note. Further, other scholars have pointed out that another descriptor in Psalm 104:4, that God has made his ministers a flaming fire, is vocabulary used to describe divine servants in ancient Near Eastern texts. For instance, 2 messengers of Yahweh sent to a meeting of Canaanite El, the high god of Ugarit, are called 2 flames. Miller writes, the messengers of Yam appear as warriors, flaming and with swords. There is no reason in this instance to assume that the figures represent lightning, but they indicate that both sides in the Baal-Yam conflict were disposed to use fire of some sort. There can be no question that these messengers are warriors. This suggestion was made by Father D. Schenkel, who also relates the messengers of Yam to the messengers of Yahweh, called Ish Lehet, in Psalm 104:4. 2. Heavenly Ones, Shemayim. The Hebrew word Shemayim occurs over 400 times in the Hebrew Bible. In nearly all cases, the referent is either the visible sky, the space above the earth, or the spiritual realm beyond or above the visible sky in which God dwells. The Hebrew word is found always in plural form. In a handful of passages, Shemayim describes the members of God's supernatural host and should be translated, though it often is not, as heavenly ones for clarity on that point. This usage should be no surprise, since it makes perfect sense that members of the heavenly host should be called heavenly ones. Psalm 89, 5-7, verses 6-8 in Hebrew, is a case in point. Let the heavens, Shemayim, praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord, a God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all who are around him? As we will discuss momentarily, this passage clearly speaks of the heavenly host as a council or assembly in the service of Yahweh, the God of Israel. This divine council has many holy ones as its constituent members. In verse 5, these holy ones are set in parallel structure to Shemayim. The holy ones are heavenly ones. Note, the ESV, heavenly beings, in verse 6, is not a translation of Shemayim, but of Bnei Elim, sons of God. See the ensuing discussion on that term. End note. Golden Gay comments on the meaning of Shemayim in this context. Alongside the parallelism of wonders and truthfulness is that of the heavens and the congregation of the holy, the latter giving precision to the former. It is the body called the divine assembly, the assembly of the gods in 82:1. Job 15:15 is another example where Shemayim should be understood as spiritual beings. Behold, God puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens, Shemayim, are not pure in his sight. While the impurity of the heavens could be abstracted to mean that the spiritual world God inhabits has been tarnished in some way by the holy ones, the Hebrew parallelism makes it clear that the heavenly ones are not pure in God's sight. The apparent meaning is that the heavenly beings of God's host or council are imperfect, and so God cannot completely trust them. This is reasonable given divine rebellion's presence in the biblical storyline. Deuteronomy 32:43 is well known to scholars as an instance of Shemayim used to describe divine beings. Here is the passage in that translation. Rejoice with him, O heavens, Shemayim. Bow down to him, all gods, Elohim. For he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land. The ESV follows the reading of the Dead Sea Scrolls in this verse. The evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls here and for Deuteronomy 32:8 shows that gods is demonstrably the correct reading. The stanza in Moses' poetic song very clearly aligns Shemayim with Elohim, and so a translation of heavenly ones is appropriate. 3. Stars, Kokavim. Since the members of God's heavenly host are referred to as heavenly ones, it should come no surprise that they are also called stars, Kokavim. Indeed, the very designation host draws the descriptions of celestial bodies in the Old Testament. The identification of personified stars with angels of the heavenly host is well accepted within a totally monotheistic religious system. The stars stand in God's presence, to the right and to the left of his throne. They serve him. At the head of the heavenly hosts stands a prince of the army, probably the highest star and the farthest from the earth, even if the actual leader is God, to whom the starry armies belong. From this conception derives the syntagm, Lord, God of hosts, Yahweh Elohe Sabaoth, occurring in numerous biblical passages. Perhaps the most familiar passage in this regard is Job 38, 5-7, where God asks Job, "Who determined the earth's measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars, Kokave Boker, sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" As we'll note later in our discussion, sons of God is a term for the divine members of God's divine family entourage. The heavenly sons of God who watched the creation of the earth are described as morning stars. In Isaiah 14:13, the hubris of the king of Babylon is analogized with that of a rebel who sought to displace the God of heaven. "I will ascend to the heaven, above the stars of God, Kokave El. I will set my throne on high." Scholars have long known that these lines in Isaiah 14 draw on a tale of divine rebellion present in Ugaritic texts, where the gods of El's council are referred to as the assembly of stars, Kekabim. The point of star language for divine members of the heavenly host should be obvious. The members of Yahweh's host are not of earth. They are celestial, transcendent beings whose home is in the heavenly realm, the abode of God. 4. Holy Ones, Kedoshim. Two passages we considered above that designate the members of God's heavenly host as heavenly ones also describe them as holy ones. The term Kedoshim may be used to describe people, but it is more often used of spirit beings in Yahweh's service. As we shall discuss in the next chapter, the designation holy ones does not denote some quality of perfection. God does indeed charge his heavenly host with error. They are not infallible. Holy ones should therefore be understood in much the same way as earthly holiness of people, places, and objects. The nature of holiness has to do with proximity to and association with the presence of God. 5. Gods, divine beings, Elohim. I've written extensively on divine plurality, the reality of multiple Elohim, in the biblical text. The biblical writers refer to the members of God's heavenly host as gods, lesser divine beings in his heavenly council or assembly. What follows will briefly summarize that prior research. We have already noted that Psalm 89, 5-7, verses 6-8 in Hebrew, describes a council or assembly of holy ones and heavenly ones under the authority of Yahweh, the God of Israel. This council is explicitly placed in the skies, eliminating the common interpretation that the sons of God in Yahweh's divine council are human beings, Israelite judges. The unambiguous nature of this passage is echoed in Psalm 82, 1 and 6. God, Elohim, has taken his place in the divine council, Adat El. In the midst of the gods, Elohim, he holds judgment. I said, "You are gods, Elohim, sons of the Most High, B'nai Ni, all of you." In Psalm 82:1, the word Elohim occurs twice. The form, morphology, of Elohim is plural. The meaning, semantics of the term, however, is most often singular. Note: as a Hebrew morphological syntax search with Bible software reveals, the Hebrew noun Elohim occurs with a singular verb predicator for grammatical agreement over 2,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. End note. In the case of Psalm 82:1, both meanings, singular and plural, are present. The first instance of Elohim has the singular participle nitzav, stands, or to take one's place, as its grammatical partner. That the second Elohim must be understood as plural in meaning is indicated by the preposition, in the midst of, becherev, that precedes it. You can't be in the midst of a singular entity. The plurality of the second Elohim in Psalm 82:1 is made obvious by Psalm 82:6. God tells the other Elohim, "You are gods, Elohim, all of you." Both pronouns you in the statement are grammatically plural. These Elohim are sons, plural, of the Most High, who must be the God of the Bible, as there is none higher. Many scholars use these passages to argue that the biblical writers at one point in Israelite history were polytheists. This thinking is misguided and rooted in a mistaken notion of what the word Elohim means. We tend to presume that the biblical writers thought about Elohim in the same way we think about capitalized G-O-D. When we see the word God, we instinctively assign a unique set of attributes, for example, omnipresence, omnipotence, sovereignty, to the letters capital G-O-D. But this presumption is incorrect and leads our thinking astray when we encounter instances where Elohim is intended to describe a group of beings instead of the lone God of the Bible. We know this presumption about Elohim is mistaken by virtue of how the biblical authors use the word Elohim. Briefly, we will find Elohim in the Hebrew Bible employed to describe spiritual beings that are clearly lesser than the God of Israel. While Elohim is used thousands of times for the singular God of Israel, it is used for spiritual beings judged by the God of the Bible, gods and goddesses of surrounding nations, territorial spirits, and the spirits of deceased people. No biblical author would think that the deceased dead or territorial spirits shared the same attributes and power as the God of Israel. The term is not intended to speak of a unique set of attributes as though the God of Israel was just one of many equals. Biblical writers were not expressing polytheism. They used Elohim in contexts that require a plural meaning for the term 1. Demons, 2. The deceased Samuel, 3. Angels, or the angel of Yahweh. The fact that biblical writers label a range of entities as Elohim that they elsewhere take pains to distinguish as lesser than Yahweh tells us quite clearly that we ought not understand Elohim as having to do with a unique set of attributes possessed by only one being. A biblical writer would use Elohim to label any entity that is not embodied by nature and is a member of the spiritual realm. This otherworldliness is an attribute all residents of the spiritual world possess. Every member of the spiritual world can be thought of as Elohim, since the term tells us where an entity belongs in terms of its nature. The spiritual realm has rank and hierarchy. Yahweh is the Most High. Biblical writers distinguish Yahweh from other Elohim by means of other descriptors exclusively attributed to him, not by means of the single word Elohim. Biblical writers also assign unique qualities to Yahweh. Yahweh is all-powerful, the sovereign king over the other Elohim, the creator of the other members of his host council, the lone Elohim who deserves worship from the other Elohim. In fact, Nehemiah 9:6 explicitly declares that Yahweh is unique. There is only one Yahweh. You alone are Yahweh. This perspective is consistent with very conservative Jewish thinking in the Second Temple intertestamental period, which followed the Old Testament era. For instance, there are nearly 180 instances in non-biblical material from Qumran's Dead Sea Scrolls where the term Elohim and Elim, also gods, describe members of Yahweh's heavenly host. Note: the approach taken here to Elohim is also contrary to Mormon doctrine. I have critiqued Mormonism's understanding of Psalm 82 and divine plurality elsewhere at invitation. End note. To summarize our findings thus far, Old Testament writers describe the nature of the members of Yahweh's heavenly host with terms such as spirits, heavenly ones, and gods, divine beings. We'll first encounter the more familiar angel in the next category.